Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Arun, for inviting me and for that most kind and extremely generous introduction, as always. It's indeed a pleasure to be back at Taxsutra, and it's indeed a matter of pride that I can see it's tremendous growth and advancement in the last few years, along with all the complexity in the tax system as well, I would imagine. So thank you once again. So my guest is Vishal Parekh, who heads Thomson Reuters in India. Vishal's been working with Thomson Reuters for about 11 years and used to work in tax earlier. He's also a chartered accountant, but having since moved on. So Vishal, what I'm going to do is, we've got about 25 minutes or so to speak today. So before I ask you a few specific questions, and I know this is going to be interactive, we're going to be using the polling device that you have for a few questions that we will pose a little later in our conversation. And we're also going to be showing you some interesting slides and insights which will help you compare where we stand versus Europe specifically. So before we launch in, a general sense on where we are in the tax environment in terms of complexity, in terms of interaction with tax authorities, and specifically from your vantage point, since you talk to so many people, since you try and solve so many people's problems.
Yeah, sure. So, I think, one of the things I did personally was, as I came into this new role over the last 6 months, and that's probably why I'm here for the first time. So thanks, Arun and Vijay, to kind of have me on stage. It's a real privilege to be here, just echoing Govind's sentiments. But, the last 6 months, I've been interacting with a lot of corporate customers and just kind of going through the news. And I feel like every month, as I look at the financial news, which Reuters kind of pulls through, as well as other apps which are on my phone, I feel more and more that 50-60% of the news items are related to either tax, new tax regulations in the world, new tax kind of decisions that are being made, as Honorable Justice kind of just mentioned, and also a lot of frauds. Obviously, that's not something which we're going to talk about, hopefully, throughout the day. But, it just shows how tax is becoming a lot more, lot different and is a lot more dynamic than it's ever been. And, again, while in our day-to-day lives we have a lot of innovations which make our lives simpler and easier, clearly the tax regulations is just getting more and more complex. So, before, I think just to kind of break the ice, I have a quick video which I'd like to show. It's actually one that I've watched probably a dozen times, but continues to put a smile on my face. And I think a lot of us will be able to relate to it. So if you don't mind just showing that.
When I grow up, I want to be a tax accountant. I want to work with numbers all day long. 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, 22 hours a day during filing season. And I want the numbers to be changing all the time, so I can keep working with them over and over and over. I want to have lots of turnover and burnt out employees. And I want to have only 3 people to do the work of 8. When I grow up out on my summer vacation, holidays, family wedding, plus all my kids' birthdays, dance recital, and school plays, so I can stay late and work on another tax return. I want to be the last to get the information to file my returns, have it take forever, and have no one care. Why do they need another copy? Don't they have the XML we gave them like 7 times? When I grow up, I want to be a CPA. I want to spend tens of thousands of dollars on a degree, so I can learn how to cut, paste, and assemble. When I grow up, I want to be a tax accountant. I want to have no time to use the bathroom or take a shower for the 6 weeks leading up to our filing deadline. When I grow up, I want to be a tax accountant. It would be so cool.
Vishal, did you want to be like, were you like that?
I think so. I guess that's probably why I find myself smiling all the time. But clearly, I didn't know all the things which they said when I wanted to be a tax accountant. So, again, I think, all said and done, I mean, obviously part 2 of this, which you can see outside the kiosk, is more around how Thomson Reuters kind of changes the game here. But Essentially, what we're talking about is, again, this is starting to get increasingly true, right, in the way we operate. And if we actually continue to operate with the spreadsheets and so on, it clearly is something which is going to be those burnt out employees. And today, with the cost pressures we have, all of us are facing these resource crunches and the sheer regulation. I can see a lot of nodding heads here in terms of sheer regulation, which is just trampling us, right, with a lot of new requirements. So I think we did a survey recently as well, and we do a lot of these. One of which I'll go into detail. But almost more than half of the people being asked the question, is regulation increasing, responded with a positive. And no surprise there, right? I mean, as Govind, you mentioned, this is really how the world is shaping up, and how the US or other jurisdictions almost on a quarterly basis come up with something pretty significantly large and new.
And you see this happening again at a broad level, both domestically as well as cross-border, right? I mean, let's say in India we've had so many new things, and you've had so many new cross-border.
Yeah, and I think cross-border is actually much more prevalent, which is why obviously India has gone through a pretty significant shift in terms of GST. But that's more of I would say a once-in-a-lifetime kind of a change. But what's happening on the cross-border front, which is also actually even more difficult to manage because there's little information. It's obviously in this group itself, there's so many very esteemed consultants and advisors and very reputed tax experts who are there to help. But when it comes to cross-border regulation, it starts getting harder and harder, right? So I think that's actually becoming a much bigger issue for the corporate suite.
And how do you see the tax function having evolved or evolving within companies?
Yeah, so I think again, the video which is actually quite deep in a lot of ways because that's how we were all working. I mean, if you think about when I was, a tax professional, tax departments used to work in a silo, right? They would sit there and everyone would be like wondering what they're doing. It's kind of a rocket scientist job, all this mumbo jumbo that happens there. And no one would be involved, no one would want to get involved. I think that's changing very, very dramatically. Today, procurement, you talk about logistics and supply chain, all of these departments are kind of impacted, and the tax department is considered a lot more strategic because of the sheer complexity and the sheer impact it has on the bottom line, not only for the CFO and the CEO, but also in the boardroom.
So in a way, even as for organizations which get bigger, you're also saying that be geared to have an organization-wide understanding of tax and tax management, rather than leaving it all to the tax department.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone's in the game now, right? I mean, as I mentioned, multiple different functions are involved.
Yeah, logistics. I mean, if you're an e-commerce company, half your company is perhaps.
Exactly, half your company is involved. And what's interesting as we speak to a lot of customers with the team here, the tax department and tax kind of head is more worried about people who are not tax experts making tax decisions, which happens a lot in the GST world, right, where everyone has to choose an HSN code, and there's not much of a surety whether he's picking the right one or the wrong one, but that's going to determine the rate. So it's a lot of that those factors which have started kind of coming up, and it's starting to really become very, very relevant in terms of how the CFO thinks about tax because of the sheer impact on the bottom line. Again, I think on that note, I had one statistic where I was just kind of looking at the net profit margin of most of the listed companies. We're talking about roughly, 5 to 8%, mid to high single digits of net profit margins. And if you look at GST today, that's on an average 15%. So that's 3x your general net profit margin. Any small mistakes on the input tax credit or how much you're charging as output can just have a significant impact which flows straight to the bottom line. So,
right. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry. Just a very profound kind of impact is what's coming up. It wasn't that it wasn't there before. It's now it's in one tax in India. It just becomes that more obvious.
But you're also saying, and quite worryingly, that the gap between knowledge and practice is also very high, and perhaps has increased because the needs of the companies or the market has increased. So, and is that having any other fallout or impact?
Yeah, so I think what's obviously that's kind of leading to, especially over the last 1 year as GST has come in, there's just a clear need to have the organization adopt a singular process. And that's where, 1 year into GST, I think the first year people are just trying to somehow get compliant. I think now the conversations we are having with our corporate customers and corporate kind of tax heads has been primarily around how do we kind of change the game here? How do we introduce a tax transformation project? How do we really kind of think about a strategic way to manage this so that there's a uniformity across the organization, whether it's a tax expert or not, and they can use tools and technology to really take that forward.
Can, an analogous question, can small businesses benefit from this as well, or how could they be more cautious or more understanding in this approach?
Yeah, so I think small businesses obviously feel the same impact, and in fact, for them not having tools and technologies can, one of the biggest issues with the small business, and I kind of work for one at some point in my life, is that the working capital cycle is so tight, right? You can't afford to have 1 week of delay, and in this instance, if you are not able to get your input tax credit right, if you're not able to get some of these very large value items right, you could really have a serious issue in terms of sustainability, which is why I think, again, Thomson Reuters as well, and obviously a lot of tools out there, but we kind of cater to the entire spectrum as well, because we have tools which will help just compliance with small businesses as well. And that actually is the crux of the matter if you think about India and someone who...
So you're saying that technology, it's a very simple question at one level. You're saying technology can actually help someone who's not so advantaged. I'm not a large company.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by just making me do things on time or something more?
No, so I think it's multiple things, right? Again, one of the global tools we have always kind of come up with is the one source indirect tax module. And what really that does is it really corrects things right at the source, which is what I mentioned to you earlier, is that there's a lot of individuals in the system now who have to make tax decisions. When you correct things at the source, the compliance becomes that much easier. So I think that's kind of the way the world's kind of going in terms of again in the US, pretty much every mid to large corporate uses the tax engine because they have 15,000 jurisdictions to cater to. It's impossible to do this manually. In India, I think slowly people are getting a sense that, yes, GST has simplified a lot of things, but if you really want to take an advantage of GST and more from a strategic nature and start thinking about your business and how it's going to help your business grow, then you've got to start embracing technology because that's what the government's doing.
Right. Well. Yeah, and I'm going to come to the government in a moment. But tell me, in your own experience, what's sort of the most amazing or complex tax addressal system that you've been asked for? You talked about 15,000 jurisdictions. So is that the most exhaustive one, or are they bigger, even wilder ones?
So the two most complex jurisdictions, and I'm sure a lot of people here will agree, is the US and Brazil. Both of which actually I've lived in for a brief period. I don't know.
So India is not, you're saying?
India, again, the World Bank came up with a report, I think somewhere in Q1, Q2, saying that the GST is probably one of the most complex tax systems in the world. I am not sure. I completely agree. This is my personal opinion. But when I see, great countries like the US and Brazil, where jurisdiction, every county has the ability to levy their own tax, I think so far, unless that changes in the near future, GST is not that complex. However, this is how things start, right? Where one state is going to decide that, hey, listen, I'm going to put a surcharge on it, and the other one's going to do that because they are allowed to do so. That could start kind of going that similar route in terms of the US and Brazil.
Right. So, but you're saying that the geographic complexity or the intricacy is what makes it complex, right?
Right, because again, it's not this. I think
in Brazil and the US.
In Brazil and the US, but the problem is any movement between one county to another just keeps on compounding things, right? And keeps on kind of figuring out, even because every county will levy its own tax, and then you have to kind of match those. And when it comes to compliance, imagine the number of returns.
And conceptually, you're saying that this is something we should be prepared for as a country, that it could happen. I mean, because political equations change and so on.
Listen, I think it's about who's going to move first, in my opinion. And if one of the states starts doing that, what's to stop the others, right? So,
Okay, and I'm sure there are others who will discuss this in more detail, but let's talk about the role of government in this. I mean, in this whole interaction between taxpayer and taxpayee and the government. What's changing there? What are the new trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I think again, with obviously GST, the government has for the first time in a very, very large scale said that this is a technological kind of change in which the way the government's going to operate. So that's kind of increasing. And while GST is obviously the one which is talked about the most, when you think about global trade, the customs department and so on, all of them are starting to adopt technology in a very, very heavy way, right? So imagine if you have one single ID, which you use for all your kind of business transactions, and the government has the ability to pull all of that in one place. There comes a point, and this has actually happened in multiple conversations I've had with our corporate kind of counterparts, where the government actually, in a meeting with the corporate, we're discussing the tax issues, has more information than the corporate, right? And that's when the tax head just really kind of loses it, right? I mean, like, oh my God, this is starting to get serious. They actually have all this information based on my records because it's all digital and electronic, and I'm struggling internally because I don't have the systems and processes to deal with it.
And I think I know what you're talking about, having seen this somewhere, because, for instance, when you make payments for, let's say, TDS deductions, right? So the government seems to have a much clearer record of what you're paying on TDS versus what you're incurring on expenditure, and obviously registering with the tax department. It is able to put all of that together and then ask whether you paid it on time or not, right?
Yeah, I think, when I was in Brazil, this is actually something which I was just amazed at. Brazil introduced this kind of system of putting things into the government almost 15 years ago. So every payment you have to make to a vendor has to go through the government system, which will issue out something called a boleto, and that's what they'll use to pay. So it is quite, it can really go that route, and that's actually working very effectively. There's a different thing about Brazil having multiple tax jurisdictions, but this aspect of it is just path-breaking. And that's kind of what I've heard is from the Indian government officials generally, that while GST was being devised, all of these things were studied.
So tell us about, when you look ahead, what is the kind of technology landscape that you see from a big picture level first? In terms of what are the 2 or 3 key problems that you're going to solve, and how is it going to manifest itself in the technology solutions companies like yours will offer to partners, customers, so on?
Yeah, no, so I think, on this note, there is a survey which I was alluding to right in the beginning. We did recently do a survey in Europe with over almost 350 tax heads and tax kind of functional people. And what's interesting is to kind of see, I'll just not go through the entire survey, but just a couple of snippets. But before that, what I'd really like to do is get the people here who represent the India tax diaspora to kind of really get their views on a few questions and then compare.
Yeah,
so I think that'll be
good.
Quite interesting.
Yeah, we have 2 questions.
Go to the first question. So the question is basically, how would you describe your current adoption of technology? Is it basic, mainly reliant on manual processes and spreadsheets, intermediate, or advanced? So I think we have 15 seconds, right? Yeah. So if you could just use the polling booth for the first time of the day, and as I think if it's on sleep mode, just press that power button. That's what I heard.
So the market for you is between 4 and 83%, is what I can say.
What's very interesting is that the fact that 83% have said it's intermediate, which is way more. Now, if you go back to the slides, it's 54% in Europe. So it's pretty, I think this is where we wanted to kind of draw the comparison, right? When we were talking about this, I think The fact that 80% of the people here have adapted technology also shows how GST has changed mindset, because my gut is, and maybe I'm wrong here, but a year ago, this would have been a lot lower.
Does anyone want to speak about this? I mean, I'm going to come back in a few minutes for questions, but does anyone want to touch upon this? Suppose you've clicked intermediate. Why did you click it, and where are you in this journey? Anyone? No. Okay, we'll come back. Next question.
Yeah, so the next question goes, so do you see tax technology as strategic to your success as a tax department? First is yes, and we have a tax strategy roadmap. Yes, but we don't have a tax strategy roadmap. And no, we can just do everything manually. It's impressive how things stacking up here. So I think again, very, very, very close to Europe. In fact, what I'd say is that in the Europe survey, what we had, if you can just go back to the slide, we had 52% say yes, but we don't have a strategy roadmap. We have 48% here, and 37% say yes, and we have a tax strategy roadmap. What's surprising is 11% said no, and over here we said. We heard no one saying no. So again,
So this is all of Western Europe or Western?
all of Europe, including the UK.
The UK and East Europe.
All of the European countries, excluding probably the extreme.
So would the 11%, for instance, be the small companies and family-run businesses?
Because there are small companies in the survey as well. I think roughly 1/3 of the survey is with small companies.
Okay. And maybe that's not represented here, which is why you're not getting that answer.
Possibly.
Okay. But if anyone wants to butt in on that and provide some insight, it would be most welcome. So, so this is a good input and sort of launch to really ask you a more horizon question.
Right.
So when you look at the next, let's say, 18 months or so, I know it is getting more complex, as we've talked about. We've talked about the cross-border nature of complexity as well. We've also talked about how the tax department, in many ways today, is smarter than you are or we are. And but at the same time, clearly, most of us are obviously willing to respond with technology, with strategy, with better understanding, and obviously a need for compliance.
Right.
So this is where we are. How is it looking ahead?
I mean, I think as I said, the road ahead is a lot of these kind of transformations which the finance departments are doing. This, so I'll go from both sides, the corporate and the government. And I think in terms of the corporate environment, as we're having these conversations globally, and I speak to my counterparts globally on a regular basis, the whole finance transformation and tax transformation journey, which corporates in the past, it was restricted to very, very large sized corporates because they understood the need for doing that. It's spreading across the board now, right? I mean, every CFO is thinking about how they're going to think about retooling their ERP systems. That's the broader finance transformation, and within that, or sometimes exclusively, it's about tax transformation. So when I say a transformation, it's obviously a buzzword, which a lot of us have used in a lot of different ways. But I think the key to that is about embracing automation and technology, because I think sooner or later everyone's realizing, including the CFOs as well as the CEOs, because they are answerable to the board, who's more and more kind of very, very harsh on zero non-compliance. It's not about whether you have a non-compliance of $5,000 or you have a non-compliance in a country where you have 0.5% of your revenue. It's just about zero non-compliance, right? So I think that is kind of bringing that very large change right from the boardroom, as opposed to even from the CFO's desk. I think that's kind of the key change on the corporate side.
And when you look at it, again, from maybe a 30,000 feet level, what's driving all these changes, which will help us understand why things will change and maybe change faster? For instance, clearly there's a post-Trump world, and that's changing the nature of trade. If trade is changing, obviously taxation systems will have to change somewhat, at least at some levels. What else could be driving these things?
No, I think one of the things which I personally feel is that over the last 11 years, I've lived in multiple countries and seen the economies in those regions. We've always talked about an open global economy. The world is shifting quite dramatically actually to the reverse, right, in some ways. And as you go towards that reverse aspect, as we also discussed earlier, I mean, I think Justice Tony kind of referred to that as well in terms of the decisions that are being made. They are all kind of coming up to a much more different kind of way than we've operated in the past. It's not about like, let's have open free trade. There is a fear that, if we are losing tax revenue, and tax revenue is the largest single contributor for any country, right, in terms of running the economy. So there's a clear push from the government side to ensure that things which were existing earlier, which I think the US has done in a big way, of kind of taxing the fee, discussion which we'll have and so on. All of these things are things which are not, it's kind of counter to what we're doing in all the other aspects of our daily lives, right, in terms of making things simpler, kind of having more and more kind of interaction across borders seamlessly. This is going a little bit in the reverse direction, and I think it's going to continue to do that.
Okay. Any questions or comments on tax and technology from anyone? Or we shall close in a few minutes. Okay, great. So last couple of questions, or pretty much the last question. So in terms of technology in itself, what is the sort of philosophy here, and how is that going to pan out in the next 18 to 24 months? As in, is it, are you going to see more artificial intelligence? Are you going to see, all of that kind of stuff? Or is it, what's the composition of philosophy as we go forward?
No, I think it's, again, a great question, because we at Thomson Reuters, I can tell us that telling from our experience, we're putting significant amount of capital spend in the hundreds of millions to ensure that we stay relevant, because as as I mentioned, the regulations increasing, we need to increasingly have better automation, AI, embrace AI. We have multiple of these technology hubs we've created across the globe, including in Canada and India and other areas, where we've started to kind of use that technological innovation which is available in some of these hotspots to power our tax technology platforms. And I think in some ways, on the corporate side, if I think about my interaction with corporate customers, I think they're realizing very quickly that this is not easy to do. Technology, automation, tax transformation is a pretty Herculean project. It will deliver benefits for years to come, but that first step you take is actually quite challenging. And I'll just go quickly. I just remember that there's one more slide in the survey. I think it's that one. So if we can just, this was actually quite shocking for me as well as I was going through the survey. The question which was asked was, what are the key challenges tax departments face in today's world? And I was surprised to see number 3 is implementing tax technology. And based on our kind of discussions with customers, prospects, I can totally see that how this is very, very challenging, especially for companies that are on that journey, because it is a significant project which touches your IT systems, which touches every department, including procurement, including logistics, as I mentioned. So you have to really think about this strategically. You have to have a roadmap in terms of how you get through this. And it is going to be a very process-oriented implementation, which could take, in some cases, years.
Right, and we did, and that's exactly what we touched upon earlier, right? How that your organization, there has to be an organization-wide understanding and appreciation of how tax is infiltrating perhaps our lives and our work lives for sure, right? So thank you very much, Vishal. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much, Arun and Taxsutra, for inviting me. And I hand it back to the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.